Okay, welcome back to part two of the impact of World War II North and South. And in the first video, we looked at the past exam questions relating to this topic. And then we focused our attention on the South, the Declaration of Neutrality by De Valera in 1939, the reasons behind that, and also the situation with the Irish Defence Forces at the time. So today we're going to look on, in the next few minutes here, we're going to look at the whole issue of the IRA threat, which will be seen as a challenge. Perhaps if you've got a question about to what extent was the Irish government successful in dealing with the challenges facing it during World War II or during the emergency, maybe this might be a paragraph you might want to look at. And then we look at relations with other countries, Germany, England, or Britain, I should say, and America. Okay, so the IRA threat was a serious one, in that De Valera was not taking it lightly. He had his problems with the IRA going back to the 1930s on becoming leader in 1932. And again, the old Republican motto of England's difficulty is Ireland's opportunity was once again kind of rearing its head at this time. And some of the Republicans were looking at this as perhaps an opportunity to try and maybe form some kind of alliance with Germany or whatever at that. Now, at the time, the IRA was quite small in number and in force, but one that De Valera was not taking lightly, especially as he did not want to hamper Ireland's neutral position in the eyes of the British and the Allies itself. So it was a chance, as I said, by some Republicans to kind of disrupt British rule here or in the north and maybe push for the ending of partition or United Ireland. They had been unsuccessful use of explosives to break out of Mountjoy prison in 1939, as well as raids on post offices and a bank as well. So they were certainly causing trouble, most notably also with a raid on the Phoenix Park magazine fort, which was storing ammunition, and they managed to succeed in taking 1 million rounds of ammunition and explosives from that. So on the 4th of January 1940, De Valera responded to this by reintroducing internment, in basically imprisoning IRA prisoners or members without any proper judicial process, and I suppose keeping them under under wraps basically. And in all, 6 IRA men were sentenced to death, would you believe, during the emergency as well. Well, as I said, while some 500 were interned at the Curragh camp at various stages. There were also many more rounded up for suspicion of Republican IRA activity under the Offences Against the State Act. And that's, again, maybe a title you might want to mention in a paragraph just to kind of show a bit of factual content to kind of back up there as well. And Ireland's military intelligence was a small group known as G2, and they had been suspicious of some Republican IRA Nazi collusion, which had begun since the war. And Sean MacBride, of course, who would go on to form Clonafoblicta in the 1940s, was active in the IRA since the 1930s. And maybe there were some overtures made by the Irish Republicans toward Germany. But our understanding is that the Germans were not reciprocating as much, and there was no major interest in some form of Nazi alliance as such. There were German spies in Ireland, okay, during the war itself, and they would often land by parachute. And when they were caught, they would be kind of essentially kept in the Curragh prison camp as well. They were not sent home. Unlike other, we'd say, British RAF officers who might have crash landed here, were kind of quietly snuck out the back door. Here, the troops were kept as so-called prisoners of war. But what I understand was they had a pretty nice time here when they were kept in the Curragh camp itself. But getting back to the IRA, the G2 was successful in tracking down German spies, and indeed Germany itself had little success in its relationship with the IRA, in that there was no real proper alliance between the two sides at all. And maybe the German leader Hitler at the time didn't have much interest in that, because there was a certain decent relationship between the German embassy and the Irish government at this time as well. So really, by 1943, the so-called IRA threat is all but non-existent at that particular point. And you could say that the government was indeed successful in dealing with this threat to neutral time. Okay, so now we're going into relations with Britain, and this is also, folks, Anglo-Irish relations as well. That's a very, very prominent question in the section of the course. So a question on Anglo-Irish relations from 1923 until 1949 would involve a discussion of relations between Cumann na Gael and the British government in the 1920s, Fianna Fáil's dismantling of the treaty in the 1930s, but also this as well, relations with Britain during World War II. And the British representative in Ireland was a guy called Sir John Maffey, and he, like his German counterpart, Dr. Edward Hempel, had a good relationship with De Valera and the Irish government, and that then, I suppose, made for more favourable terms between him personally and the Taoiseach of the day itself. However, relations with the wider British cabinet were not particular with Winston Churchill. And there you can see Sir John Maffei there. Churchill, as I said, was very, very critical of his predecessor, Neville Chamberlain's handing over of the treaty ports in 1938. And then becoming Prime Minister in June of 1940, he was very much an outspoken critic of Irish neutrality and indeed, I suppose, Irish nationalism as well, going back as far as the treaty time itself in 1921. But Churchill, as I said, was not too impressed by De Valera's policy of neutrality. He sends a guy called Malcolm MacDonald to Ireland to try and, I suppose, tease De Valera and offer so-called unity. Now, was that a united Ireland or what? Well, that's open to debate. But De Valera was simply not going to accept any kind of deal with the British. Maybe he'd learned the lessons of 1914 to 1918 in World War I, where the then Irish nationalist leader John Redmond pledged support for the British war effort in the hope of Home Rule. And we saw how that turned out. De Valera was completely rejecting any kind of abolition of a neutral policy in return for the so-called offer of unity, which was always a bit kind of shaky to begin with. De Valera was apparently promised by the British a declaration accepting the principle of Irish unity, the setting up of joint bodies north and south to work out the constitutional details of that union, and in return, Ireland, or IRA as was known from 1937 until 1949, would offer immediate support to the British war effort and in return get the so-called offer of unity. Note there is no mention of Ulster Unionism in that whole discussion and communication. So, I mean, they certainly were not going to go for some kind of United Ireland at this point. So, De Valera did not accept the offer. He could only say that a United Ireland to be offered. In return, he would allow for American ships to use Irish ports and maybe allowing for troops to pass through. But that was all that they were offering. He was not offering Irish men to go and fight with the Allies as such. So ultimately, nothing came of these negotiations, and Churchill was quite scathing of that. And indeed, the British government went with De Valera's policy of neutrality as he pursued it during the war. But I suppose we did mention earlier on as well in the previous video that relations between the two was still cordial enough, and Ireland certainly was kind of famously in 1945, in May of that year, when the war did end. Churchill gave a victory speech, and in that he was personally critical of De Valera and the Irish. And De Valera then responded likewise on Irish radio, thanking Churchill in a way for respecting Irish neutrality and not endearing another, I suppose, bloody chapter between the two countries. And he was greeted on the streets as he came out of Radio Éireann at the time for that. So that's just maybe a discussion that you might want to involve, of course, again, in relation to Ireland in World War II in the South, but also very, very important as well in relation to Anglo-Irish relations questions, should that come up from 1939 onwards. Okay, so really, again, maybe not as important, but one worth noting. If you were to get a general question on Ireland during World War II and the challenges facing it, you could bring down or mention, I suppose, the whole issue with Germany. We've already alluded to some of that already with the IRA, but the German ambassador was a guy called Dr. Edward Hempel, and he had been in that position in 1937 and had quite a good relationship with De Valera and the Irish government. There were a number of German attacks on the south, apparently mistaken attacks, one famously in Campbell, County Wexford in 1940, and also then the North Strand bombings in Dublin in May 1941. This was around the time of the dockside raids and fire raids in Belfast. And of course, at the time, the Irish government had sent up a number of fire brigades to help out with assistance. And some say that this particular incident was maybe a warning to the south not to get involved. And as you can see, 27 people were killed in the North Strand bombings of May 1941, which certainly was causing alarm in the south. However, Germany resisted any full-scale attack on the south, thankfully. And you can see some of the damage done there to commercial holdings in Campbell, County Wexford. And there you can see civilian damage done to dwellings, domestic dwellings in the North Strand in Dublin, as I mentioned, with 27 lives lost in that attack itself. So, we did, I suppose, experience a small bit of wartime destruction, but thankfully nothing on the scale of those in Belfast and indeed Northern Ireland and mainland UK. So there, as I mentioned, that this may have been in response to the Dublin fire brigades going up from Dundalk and Dunleary to help out with the Blitz attacks. And again, that has been debated by historians itself. Throughout the war, though, the neutral stance towards the Axis powers was maintained. In other words, that we did not we did not give in to calls to expel the Japanese, the Italian, or indeed the German embassy ambassadors from Dublin. and that was maintained throughout the war. And whereas in other European countries they were banned and they were booted out. Also, as well, I mentioned before, but when Mussolini died in 1943, I think the Irish government did offer their condolences. And indeed, it should be noted as well that in April 1945, with the death of Franklin D. Roosevelt, De Valera also offered his condolences to the Americans. But perhaps most controversially of all was with the death and suicide of Adolf Hitler in May 1945. De Valera also went to the German embassy to offer his condolences, which maybe in latter years, in hindsight, he probably regretted that move itself as perhaps not his finest. Finally, in this discussion, we're just going to look at relations with the US. Now, like the British, the US were um, had a close relationship with Ireland, but they were certainly, like the British as well, one of the most outspoken critics of neutrality. Franklin D. Roosevelt, greatly influenced by the British Prime Minister of the day, Winston Churchill, certainly was not impressed and had maybe a distorted view about Irish neutrality. It's to understand why the Irish didn't get involved in the war effort. So much so that the American ambassador David Gray was also summoned to De Valera to make his point known that the Irish government should get involved in the war effort on the side of the Allies. However, De Valera resists this, much to the annoyance of the American president, and indeed Frank Aiken, I think, went to the White House and met with him as well, looking for some kind of military assistance in terms of weapons and defence, and was promptly shown the door because Ireland was still maintaining a neutral stance. However, as the war progresses from 1942 onwards, this kind of policy of friendly neutrality saw the Irish government perhaps turn a blind eye as American troops flew over Irish airspace in Donegal, landing into the Northern Ireland state as they then made their preparations for things like the D-Day landing in 1944. In 1944, also, an American note demanded that De Valera break off diplomatic relations with the Axis powers of Germany, Italy, and Japan. We've alluded to that a moment ago, i.e., by closing the embassies. De Valera refused to do this and simply ignored the bullying tactics of the US. And that kind of, I suppose, further enhanced his own popularity